Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. Earlier this month, Bronxites experienced the deadliest fire the city has seen in over 3 decades. The fire took the lives of 17 people, and there are several more in the hospital with life altering injuries. Reports say the fire started due to a faulty space heater, but people are now questioning the living conditions within the building during frigid temperatures. Joining me for discussion on tenant rights is Supervising Attorney Justin La Mort. Justin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So, trying to escape very cold weather, a family used a space heater to warm up. Unfortunately, during this time of the year, this is very common. Can you explain how often families in New York City struggle to keep warm this winter?
Sadly, it's an all too common story that we hear at my office at Mobilization for Justice. According to HPD, who runs the 311 calls, they get around 100,000 unique calls, meaning 100,000 different buildings that are having heat issues. And that doesn't even include public housing, NYCHA, which is notorious for having a loss of heat and hot water during the winter months.
Now, people often voice their concerns about the lack of hot water and heat in their building during these months. Why aren't landlords supplying adequate heat and hot water to their tenants?
It comes down to cost. Often with these buildings that they only get so much amount of money coming in towards rent, and they make the decision not to spend money onto their building. And as such, the tenants suffer.
Wow. So I didn't know that was a conscious decision that they were making. So that's very interesting to know. And it's a little bit sad. But if you take a look at your screen, you can see the heat laws of our city. So I would like to break this down a little further. Can you just explain what we're seeing?
Sure. So starting October 1st, it's heat season under the laws in New York City. And what heat season means from October 1st to May 31st is that during the daytime, which is 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., if it is 55 degrees or colder outside, it must be at least 68 degrees inside. Now, during the evening hours, which is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., inside must be heated at 62 degrees or warmer. If not, it's a violation of law.
So are the landlords following this law? We're hearing that, sometimes they're making this decision not to provide certain heat. So can we say that landlords are following this law?
Many landlords do follow this law and provide heat. Unfortunately, there are also many landlords, including the city of New York through public housing, that do not.
So we typically see this in housing units that are occupied by low income tenants. At this point, should it be considered discrimination or even neglect? And are we seeing these same cases in buildings with higher income tenants?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. So, legally, discrimination has a very specific definition. But the reality is that most low income renters are often Black or brown. And they are often subject to some of the worst housing conditions that we see, the most tragic being the most recent fire in the Bronx. And so when we're looking at how this treatment is happening, I'm reminded of a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. as we just celebrated his birthday, where he thought it would be easier to solve the voting rights in our country than it would be to make sure that Black and brown people could have safe housing. And that has kind of rung true of what we've seen. So is it discrimination? In practice, yes. Consciously, I don't know. But what I do know is that people are not investing in their buildings, that they're not listening to people complain about heat, and instead blaming it on the tenants. And that is putting people's lives at danger, and that can't be allowed to continue.
Now, according to an article from Bloomberg, older buildings with cheaper rents can be grandfathered into building codes that don't require as many fire safety measures as newer, more expensive buildings. Have you found this to be true? And if so, is this even legal?
That is legal, and this is a very common issue with the law. So when you live in an older building and then the laws change, two things happen. Either older buildings can be grandfathered in, meaning they're not subject to the new law unless they go through a major renovation. And the reason being is to actually protect tenants in a way, because if a building built in 1910 had to come up to 2020 standards, it would cost significant amounts of money. And often in for-profit housing, those costs to renovate and improve are going to be passed down to the tenants, to which they can't afford those rents. But we also see this happening in buildings that are not that old. That fire happened in a building that was built in the 1970s, which is hardly old for New York housing stock. So we see this across the spectrum.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that. Okay, thank you for sharing that with us. And I thought like a building in 1970 was considered like a little bit older, but I guess like it's for much older buildings. So thank you for, kind of clarifying that. The apartment building located at 333 East 181st Street had a history of serious violations related to heat, ventilation, and other safety issues. Of course, everyone, needs housing and we want everyone to be housed, but how are these buildings allowed to operate in such horrendous conditions?
Because the city doesn't take action and the landlord does not voluntarily improve it. My office has been representing several people in that building, and we represent tenants across the city who are asking for one thing: to have safe housing. And often the landlords refuse to do it or they put up delays. And the only way to force them is either for people to take them to court, as organizations like my Mobilization for Justice does, or for the city, whether it's the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, to sue them, or perhaps even on a greater scale, we see action by the Attorney General's office. But unless there is enforcement, people are going to continue to suffer.
So now we know that people need to kind of make their voice heard. And I do hear that complaints to landlords and managements often go ignored. What is the best course of action for someone who's paying to live somewhere to get their landlords to listen to them? And what can they do if their safety is continuously being violated?
So at our website, we have a list of things that tenants can do, and part of your choices depend on what type of housing you live in. That's one thing that almost all tenants can do is call 311 and file that complaint. Um, First, you should talk to your landlord and give them the opportunity to do the right thing, and hopefully they do. If they don't, call 311. And if that doesn't work, you can escalate it. For tenants who are rent control or rent stabilized, they can file a DHCR rent reduction order and actually prevent the landlord from increasing their rent until the repairs are made. For other tenants, such as in public housing or those who are unregulated, they also, or rent stabilized, can also bring a court case called an HP in housing court, and actually sue the landlord to do those repairs. Originally, housing court was created to make sure people had safe housing to bring these types of cases. But unfortunately, what we see is only about 6% of all housing court cases are about repairs. And I would love to see that number increase by tenants asserting their rights and making sure that they and their families can live safely in their homes.
Now, do these rights also apply to, or these like things that they can do, did this also apply to those living in NYCHA apartments?
Absolutely. So NYCHA tenants have their own hotline that can be called. And if NYCHA fails to make those repairs, then the 400,000 people who live in NYCHA have every right to sue NYCHA in housing court, just like any other tenant.
Oh, wow. I think that's so important. And a lot of people, unfortunately, don't know that they have those options or are afraid to take those options. You talked a little bit about your organization and what you do. Can you tell us, how like, accessible it is to people and is it free?
Yeah, so organizations like mine, Mobilization for Justice, provides free legal services to tenants in New York City. And if people are looking to get connected with an attorney, they can also call 311 and get that information. And if you're looking for my organization, please visit our website, mobilizationforjustice.org, and we have a Get Help button where we help people, whether it's housing, immigration, debt collection, foreclosure, get the help that they need for free.
Now, you talked a little bit about taking legal action, and I want to know, is there other ways that we can hold the city accountable for letting these issues slide or go unnoticed? And I think a lot of people want questions from, those in power on like why we waited till this moment to actually kind of have these conversations on a larger scale.
Sadly, it often takes a catalyst of tragedy to make sure that progress is made. So if people would like to see the city do more, then you should be contacting your city council member. You should be contacting Mayor Adams, because those are the ones in charge of the money and the people running the city agencies that can do that enforcement.
And I also want to add that, as we mentioned previously, that it is predominantly Black and Brown people who are experiencing some of the harsher conditions when it comes to buildings. I also feel like these communities, For the Bronx 181st Street fire, it was a large immigrant community. I think that sometimes people may be afraid or scared. What would you say to encourage these people to kind of really speak up and take charge of what's happening?
Sadly, some of those who are in the worst conditions are often the most marginalized in our society, but they have rights as do every other tenant in New York City. But those rights are only mean something if people are willing to stand up and take action. And organizations that provide free attorneys like Mobilization for Justice, the Urban Justice Center, and many of my colleagues around the city are willing to help. So please document your problems with pictures. Take heat logs if you don't have heat. Contact your landlord and keep a record of those contacts. And if they refuse to do the right thing, you too have the right to bring them to court because you deserve to live in safe housing.
And can you just quickly tell us, how do you actually keep a record?
Sure. So, depending on the type of condition, one way to keep a record is if you have a thermometer in your house to actually keep track of if they are not following the rules about the heat. So that way, if there's a question of, well, what proof do you have? You've kept your notes. And if you have other problems, taking pictures with your camera phone is a great way to get evidence, such as mold or water leaks or maybe rodents. By having that proof, if someone tries to disregard what you're saying it's not real or you're causing the problem, that you then have evidence that you can show as a government or as a court to prove that these problems are real and that they need to be fixed.
Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me about this. Can you just tell us, how can people stay up to date with you and learn more about their tenant rights?
Absolutely. My organization has a great website, mobilizationforjustice.org, or you can follow us on Twitter at MFJ Legal. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Lamort underscore ESQ, where I spend a lot of time trying to make sure people are informed about their rights as tenants.
Thank you so much. We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.